Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm the President and CEO. As we are live streaming this event, I also want to welcome those who are joining us remotely. And for those of you active on Twitter, please join the conversation using hashtag Big Data Arms Race. So that's a long hashtag, Big Data Arms Race, but it's easy to remember. We are gathered today for the official release of the new report, Big Data, a 21st Century Arms Race, which is the culmination of a year-long research project conducted in partnership with Thomson Reuters on the national security implications of the big data revolution. And as such, first and foremost, Kate, where are you? Incognito. So I want to first thank Kate Friedrich, the Thomson Reuters Vice President of Global Government Affairs, for partnership on this effort and many other efforts. We really value this partnership. We've got a lot of important good work done in it, so thank you. Your team's knowledge of the issues and dedication to the project was critical in getting us over the finish line on this report. A big thanks as well to our Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative team, and a salute to Sam Klein for his relentless work on all aspects of this report, and to Matt Burrows for all aspects of all the work that he does, which has just been such a tremendous addition and contribution to the Atlantic Council's work on strategy and strategic foresight. The team's mission is to identify and assess global trends to inform policy and draw implications for strategy. And this report certainly does tackle some major unfolding trends. The big data revolution, which has seen rapid advancements in computing power, data storage, and collection and analytical tools, has massive implications for everything from national security to the global financial system. I think we're really just now wrapping our minds around all the implications of big data. With today's adversaries stepping up their use of cyber capabilities and other technologies in their attacks, the threat environment is faster paced and more complex than ever before. Fortunately, big data is providing a new toolkit to help confront such a dynamic and highly unpredictable security landscape. Web-connected sensors and mobile technologies are creating more data, we know that, while artificial intelligence and machine learning allows this data to be quickly processed and analyzed. The value of all this data must be balanced with the privacy concerns of the public as well. We've got a terrific lineup of experts this morning to unpack the specific policy implications of this revolution and explain what it means for decision makers today. And this is a world that we're going to continue to look at over time. First, a few of the report's authors will discuss their findings and recommendations. And then two panels will dive further into the details, discussing a range of issues from detecting insider threats, a bigger and bigger issue, to tracking terrorist activity, to improving anti-money laundering efforts and disrupting criminal organizations. While this report may be meaningful and thick and full of good information, it hardly goes as far as one can go in the discussion and the work that we'll do to follow up. There are so many facets of life that big data revolution is touching, and how important it will be for future security and prosperity of the United States and its allies and partners. So take time to read through it, give us your feedback and what you see there, and also provide us some ideas of what you think we ought to be doing next in this field. Before we get to our discussion, I'd like to introduce Malcolm Wright, the global head of anti-money laundering and fraud at Thomson Reuters, who's flown in from London to join us for this event. And he'll provide some introductory remarks as well. Malcolm has worked in several financial crime roles within Thomson Reuters and has a particular focus on anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism using and applying many of the powerful tools that Thomson Reuters has at hand. He also holds the International Compliance Association's International Diploma in Anti-Money Laundering. So Malcolm, It's a great pleasure to have you at the Atlantic Council. It's a great pleasure to have us on your side in this battle, and I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Fred, for those kind remarks. I'd like to thank Barry Pavel and the Scowcroft Centre for International Security, and specifically Dr. Matthew Burrows, Sam Klein, and the Foresight, Strategy and Risks Initiative for partnering with us on this timely and important report. I'd also like to thank Tim Adams, President and CEO of the Institute of International Finance and former Undersecretary for the Treasury for International Affairs, for his leadership as chair of this report. And I'd like to thank the 5 authors, 3 of whom are here today, for their hard work on this report. Each has brought a wealth of unique experience and expertise to the project, and I think that that is reflective in the report. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Steve Rubley, the Managing Director of Thomson Reuters Government Division, and the Government Enterprise Team for their support in this endeavour. We started this initiative in 2015 with a successful conference called Big Data, Bad Actors. The feedback and outcomes of the summit set the stage for the report and today's event. Big data gets a lot of discussion these days, whether it's the scrutiny over what data is being collected or the ways it can help business and the economy to grow. But the area we want to discuss today is a little different. It's the duality of big data, how technology is being used by bad actors, whether individual criminals, organised crime, cyber attackers, violent extremists, or human traffickers. And at the same time, it provides a powerful tool for law enforcement and the private sector to fight those very activities. Bad actors are using ever more creative and technologically advanced ways to exploit systems and controls in order to survive and to grow. The work of the organisations that many of us here today are involved in could be likened to Hercules' ancient battle against the multi-headed Hydra, where as soon as one head was defeated, 2 more would appear in its place. They adapt and evolve, but now it's with a new modern context. This is why initiatives such as this one, leading to this report, are so important. As the report title indicates, data is the 21st century arms race. Information is power, and we're only really now starting to understand what this will truly mean. Thomson Reuters is on the ground floor of this battle. Our risk management business, which includes WorldCheck, serves the needs of 49 of the world's top 50 banks, and over 300 government intelligence agencies, and over 10,000 companies spanning 180 countries. Our investigative services partner with law enforcement and private sector companies to bring bad actors to justice and to protect the public. Companies and the public sector rely on us to provide the intelligence and tools they need to make the informed decisions based on risk and opportunity. From identifying money laundering risk at financial institutions to using public records to track down fraud, corruption, and other criminal activities. We are there with the intelligence, the expertise, and the technology to help governments, law enforcement, and the private sector to make informed decisions. This report explores the broader security and financial implications of the big data revolution and offers concrete recommendations to governments, multilateral organizations, and the private sector on how to better utilize big data technology in the fight against financial crime. You'll hear more about that from Dr. Burrows and some of our authors in just a moment. Following the report discussion with the authors, we have an impressive group of experts from government and industry here to delve into exactly how bad actors are using big data and advanced technologies, and more important, how government and private sector are working together to address this challenge. I look forward to a series of engaging discussions today. I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Matthew Burrows, Director of the Foresight, Strategy and Risks Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Prior to the Atlantic Council, Dr. Burrows served as Councillor to the National Intelligence Council and Director of Analysis and Production Staff at the CIA. He also served as CIA analyst for the Directorate of Intelligence, covering Western Europe, including the development of European Union institutions, such as the European Union. From 98 to 99, he was also the first holder of the Intelligence Community Fellowship and served at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Other previous positions included assignments as Special Assistant to the US UN Ambassador Richard Holbrooke from 1999 to 2001, and Deputy National Security Advisor to the US Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill from 01 to 02. He is a member of the Directorate of Intelligence Senior Analyst Service. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Burrows and our authors to the stage.
Thank you very much. So this first panel, we want to talk about the actual report. If you haven't seen the report, it's out there. It looks like this.
Sorry.
And we have three of the authors here. And I want each of the authors, which I'll introduce just shortly, to talk about the chapter that they did, but particularly to highlight the big takeaways for policymakers. So on my left is Miran Aparicio, Counsel and Senior Consultant at the World Bank Global Practice. She authored the 5th chapter in the report, Mitigating Financial Crime Risk. To her right, or to her left, is Erica Briscoe, Chief Scientist at the ATS Laboratory, Georgia Tech Research Institute, and she authored Chapter 5 on insider threats. And then at the end of the row here is Benjamin Dean, who is the Ford Media Democracy Fund Technology Exchange Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. That's a very long title. And he wrote Chapter 3 on the looking at big data as the latest tool in fighting crime. So, Miran, I wanted to start with you and tell me, what are the big takeaways in your chapter?
Sure. First, there are some tensions between transparency laws and data privacy laws. And it is important for transparency laws and financial crime laws to start a dialogue with the regulatory authorities to provide probably some exemptions to mitigate financial crime risks. It is important also that regulatory authorities establish a dialogue to identify obstacles to RegTech innovation. RegTech innovation, Regulation and Technology, or RegTech, has a great potential to help financial supervisors and streamline compliance processes in banks. And it should be also a dialogue open between regulators to identify obstacles that can, for fintech companies to experiment on that. And finally, I think big data analytics are essential for financial services to fight financial crime. Basel Committee has actively recommended financial sector to employ data analytic tools. This is currently a reality in the United States and the European Union, but not around the world. And I think this is important to follow this recommendation also, not only for financial sector, but also for fintech companies that provide financial services such as loans or trading securities or commodities like virtual currency exchanges that operate online in order to prevent risk. And financial sector gatekeepers like a trust also, they should be employing the same data analytic tools, in my opinion.
And you mentioned, US, Europe, you have these tools and they're being used, but what's your recommendation for trying to spread it across the world beyond those two centers?
Mm-hmm. Basel, I mean, the European Union and the United States, in the legislation, they don't typically specifically provide for this use of big data analytics, but law enforcement authorities and financial supervisors, when they come for inspection visits, they expect financial firms to use adequate controls in place, to have adequate controls in place. For example, FinCEN in Eurobank found that fined the bank because they didn't have, they relied too much on manual controls. And this is not appropriate when the bank has international activities in place. So financial firms in the rest of the world should follow Basel Committee of Banking Supervision recommendations, which is for banks who operate internationally, should have adequate automatic tools in place to detect suspicious transactions and monitor clients' activities.
Okay, so just to try to get them to begin to adopt these practices and tools.
Mm-hmm,
So
absolutely.
it's an effort, really an international effort to spread this. Erica, do you want to give me your top 3 takeaways for policymakers?
Sure. So with regard to insider threat, I think regardless if we're talking about a corporate environment with employees and employers or in a government citizen sort of situation, probably the most important thing for any insider threat program or concentration is the transparency of that program. It is necessary, again, rather within a government or a corporation, that there is a trust environment. There's a relationship of mutual trust such that both sides believe that they're in a situation everyone can achieve their goals. So with an insider threat program, transparency is just extremely necessary to maintain that trusting environment. Especially as we move towards more of the computational tools that are being deployed within the big data environments. So with the knowledge that the data that everyone produces could be used to characterize these people, we need this sort of understanding between the government or the employers that they're acting in our best interest, and to do that requires transparency. Second, I think there is required proactive systems in place such that privacy and personal information is protected. Again, sort of towards that transparency element, but where people believe that their best interests are not being put to the side, and that they are safe to operate within an environment such that that the people who might be monitoring or conducting these sort of analyses are actually taking steps towards protecting personal information. Because many of the methods that can be utilized within these environments, utilizing big data, don't necessarily require personal information to come into play. So the proactiveness there is extremely valuable. And lastly, I'd say really the fostering and deliberate creation of a cybersecurity mindset within organizations or citizens is extremely necessary. And this usually has to come from a leader position. So leadership-driven cybersecurity principles. Again, hearkening to the transparency, but an environment in which we all understand that we're in it together, and that not working against each other, but working in full knowledge of what's going on, so that the practices that are in place, I understand as a citizen or an employee why they're being placed on me. And a lot of that will be accomplished through training and sort of a knowledge sharing environment. So I think those are the 3 big things.
And could you explain a little bit, when we talk about insider threat, I mean, we're talking about a lot of different behaviors. Mm-hmm. And so could you talk a little bit about those different behaviors
Sure.
and what kind of remedies for combating them?
Sure. So there's lots of way to classify insider threat. I guess that the easiest is the dichotomy between the intentionally malicious and the careless insider. So in terms of how systems or programs can be put in place to counteract those, for the careless insiders, it's much more of a sort of a awareness campaign or sort of safeguards in place that alert users to when they're being careless. Of course, most of the attention that we read about are on the malicious side, so the people who are intentionally exporting private information or proprietary information in order to hurt an organization or to benefit themselves in some other way. So those methods are, especially when we're talking about the computational ones that utilize big data, are a little bit more sophisticated. And I think we've all seen that some of the traditional safeguards, such as just having classified networks, multi-level security, aren't usually enough to catch all the variability in bad behavior. So what we look to now is to develop much more sophisticated methods that really leverage how we, human behavior, how we understand humans, what are their normal behavioral patterns, as well what are the motivations for them to do something malicious, intentionally malicious. So by using things like machine learning, we can build up models and patterns of behavior such that when someone is leaning towards bad behavior, even before they get there, we're able to be alerted or at least have attention drawn to that particular behavior.
Okay. Benjamin, do you want to talk a little bit about your chapter? I know you have a story to tell.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. I should just start by saying I prepared this chapter prior to starting my fellowship at the Center for Democracy and Technology. So today I'm speaking to you in a personal capacity, but with that formality out of the way, over the weekend I was trying to prepare for our discussion today, and I did not want to just recount what's in my chapter, because you already have the report. So what I will instead do is tell you a brief anecdote in the hope that it illustrates the recommendations that I have in the report. Over the weekend, I was in Philadelphia. I was volunteering at an organization, a clinic, that provides services, health and housing, to opioid addicts. And in the course of that afternoon, I saw from my interactions that there's perhaps some lessons from this that I think will illustrate the recommendations. I was speaking to the man who runs the clinic, and he's been doing it for 20 years. He told me that Philadelphia is one of the centers of the opioid crisis in America. In the last 2 years, that they have had double the number of people going through that clinic. It's gone from 4,000 to 8,000 people. Now, when he told me that, that's quite anomalous to have such growth. And so it piqued my interest, such a huge increase. So I asked him, why is that the case? And it turns out that Philadelphia is one of the gateways for heroin and fentanyl for the United States. It comes through the ports. And he explained that after September 11, security was tightened in New York City's ports. And so now the drugs are channeled through Philadelphia's ports. The inspectors there are only able to inspect a very small proportion of the containers that come through. And as a result, it can be quite profitable to attempt to ship opioids through those ports. Now, it occurred to me, having written this report, and you'll find in one of the boxes that I look at this trend of predictive policing. And one way in which one might approach the situation of opioids in Philadelphia would be to go out and collect information on the buyers and sellers of opioids on the streets. And that is the approach that has been adopted, for the most part, in the cases that I cover in the chapter, with really quite moderate results, we'll say. It's the issue with this approach is that it's buying and selling on the street. It's not a very well-bounded problem. There's many parameters. you have incomplete information, and there's an element of randomness, which is not really the best environment to be using some of these predictive analytic techniques. And it occurred to me, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but if you were to think at a systemic level, what are the causes behind this issue? You would start looking at the ports, and if the problem is that the capacity constraints in inspecting the containers prevents them from doing so, well, there's something that predictive analytics are really good at, and it's understanding bounded, well-structured, complete information situations like, what's the probability that a container is going to contain contraband? This is a problem much more like chess in the sense the rules are bounded. Complete information, you can see everything on the board, and you can derive a probabilistic score out of that. It strikes me that this is probably a more useful implementation of big data analytics. And in the green room before, we were saying, actually, there's another level above that, which is the financial flows. My point is this. If you sat down with your big data team and you said, we're going to go and use these tools to address the opioid issues in Philadelphia, do you think that the big data team will know the ground truth that's going on in Philadelphia? I suspect they won't. And so the first recommendation in my chapter is that one has to put together teams that are able to combine a knowledge of what is happening on the ground, able to step back and see at a systems level what are the underlying causes behind these issues we see emerging in complex societies. You obviously have to have people that understand the data analytic techniques that they're using. Then you need people who can communicate the findings and operationalize those findings. This is not always given, and you'll see in a lot of the cases I use in my chapter in the past that attempts to use big data have often fallen into pitfalls for these very reasons. And although the tools are getting more powerful, those underlying problems have not gone away. In fact, if anything, they're even more important to address, given the power of these tools.
So what do institutions need to do when they're thinking about big data?
Well, depending on the size of the organization, I think one would find with a small organization these kind of multifunctional teams, collaborative teams, perhaps more natural. In large established organizations like law enforcement and intelligence agencies, one might have to reconfigure the teams that one uses. And one might actually have to go out and find people who have got what is not a traditional background, people who are able to integrate the quantitative knowledge and ability to use these models with the more qualitative elements of understanding how the world works on the ground in order to understand what the results are saying to them.
Okay, so we have three experts all who deal with different kinds of institutions.
In my institution,
So be interesting, yes, please, to talk about.
I think it's very interesting what has been said. I completely agree. For financial sector, I think it's similar. It's different, but I think it's very important to fine-tune the tools because devil is in the details. So in two ways. One is setting the appropriate thresholds. Because institutions sometimes, you have too many red flags to analyze. That means that there are a lot of false positives, for example. If you have too little, that means that maybe you program the threshold too loud so that there are not many alerts to be analyzed. And that creates, you may miss information there. For example, in Wachovia case, Vincent fined Wachovia for setting the thresholds so that the compliance team could analyze only 80 alerts per month. That was clearly insufficient to detect the red flags of the activities of the bank. And so setting appropriate thresholds is important. Another important thing is to aggregate activities across the borders. So for global banks that operate internationally, sometimes it is a challenge for, you have IT challenge, you have cost challenge, you have data privacy laws that impede sometimes data flows, international data flows. But it's very important, ideally, to comply with also Basel recommendations, you should aggregate data so you can have the oversight of the activities of the client globally. Otherwise, you can also miss information. And there has been cases where, particularly, I mean, you have mirror trades in different countries operating in Russia and in London, and then you don't see that the client is trading through beneficial ownership of different companies on the two sides of the trades, and it's laundering money with this transactions. So it's very important to aggregate data globally as well.
Okay.
Similarly, with insider threat, or at least cybersecurity in general, that aggregation is very difficult. And again, it seems too often that the information security processes are divorced from maybe some of the more intelligence gathering or intelligence repositories that exist out there. So while an information security operation and an organization might be looking at the threats that are hitting them, they're not very much aware of what else is going on in the world. And a lot of that is due to the fact that activities are going on in the world that might be detrimental to other companies, organizations. Those organizations don't want to share that information because then it represents or it demonstrates their vulnerabilities. So to get that ground truth, we need this marrying of kind of global knowledge of what's happening, paired with our ability to quickly detect it.
Would you want to talk a little bit more about where you see the future of big data?
Well, yes, I can do that. I would just echo the idea of thresholds. I was spending some time with network operators the other day, and the thing is, once they've got the big data analytics in place to detect incidents, there are too many incidents. And actually, it ends up being a bit counterproductive because they spend more time trying to get through the incidents than actually addressing what is the problem underlying it. So that is very important. I fully support that. As I look around globally at what's going on with a lot of this technology around what we might call broadly artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's clear to me that when I keep a very close eye on what is happening in China, that what is happening is that those organizations that have managed to collect high quality data sets in the past 2 decades are now using those data sets to train machine learning and artificial intelligence applications in a way that creates a positive feedback loop. So I worry a little bit about Europe at this stage because the Europeans do not have the data that the Googles and Facebooks of the world do in California. And I look at what's happening in China and you see, well, for a long time it's been closed off from the rest of the world in terms of IT. Once you build those data stores, you can create a positive feedback loop where certain entities, whether they are private corporations or public agencies, once they have that information there, you can recreate it at almost zero marginal cost. And very quickly, this positive feedback loop kicks in a way in which they will just race ahead of everyone else. That, I think, is happening. We're watching it.
Do you think data, this is for everybody, data privacy is a problem? And to what, we have, groups here too are very concerned about how data is used. So, and obviously you're kind of on the other side of it, looking at, wanting more and more data. Usually that's what analysts like to see. But, how do we square the circle on that?
Yeah, I think we're, as with a lot of things that are disruptive technology, I think we're kind of far behind in terms of the policy catching up, especially with regard to privacy. And I think we see this a lot. Like you said, I love data and always want more, but there comes a time, at least a couple of times a year, where people offer me data and I don't want it because I know it has too much personal and privacy information in it. So I think we have a long way to go to catch up with that, and I think it's especially a problem given the ubiquitous nature of devices that are collecting data now. So, for example, smart cities or the Internet of Things, everything's collecting data. And I really think I'm a big proponent of almost on board, so at the sensor level of privacy ensuring software, basically, such that it's not the responsibility, it's not an executive function that the data gets pulled back and then it's someone's job or an algorithm's job to remove all that data because there's too much room for a mistake or leakage. So I think there should be a big push to installing, literally, but also instilling this notion that privacy needs to be maintained at a very low level, even at the data capture.
I couldn't agree more. I think both are very important needs and need to be balanced. However, I think that it is essential also for financial intelligence units to cooperate internationally to have access to certain data. So, laws should provide for exemptions based on security or transparency and needs. And that doesn't mean that data that the access to should be used irresponsibly. You should protect privacy rights, of course, and cybersecurity, address cybersecurity concerns. But however, I think there should be starting a dialogue. I think there should be ways to be able to do that.
And the dialogue with publics, educating them on the uses of data so that it isn't as scary as...
Yeah, between agencies, particularly between data privacy agencies, which are sometimes very focused on their needs, and financial intelligence units. That should be at which level? Financial Stability Board should start a dialogue, for example. But there's an international need to share certain type of data for security purposes among financial intelligence units and enhanced cooperation on that. Doesn't mean to have direct access, but at least international cooperation.
What do you say to people concerned about profiling? Benjamin?
Well, quickly on privacy, a topic near and dear to my heart. I like the way that it was phrased, is privacy a problem? Privacy, in my mind, is a solution. Because the problem is that as these large data stores are amassed, they are only available to some people. And so that creates information asymmetries. It's an economics term to say some people know more than others, and it creates an imbalance in power dynamics. That, I think, is a big concern, especially with these arms race dynamics that are emerging. Some entities will become substantially more powerful than others by virtue of the fact that some people are completely transparent while others are not. With profiling has been problematic for a very long time. It really depends what you're going to do with it, the data that you've collected and the profiles you've delivered. Suffice to say, these profiles are becoming more and more detailed and more if they are misused, lost and misused, the fact that they are becoming so dangerous now brings up new risks for individuals who have been profiled. And I think those risks, or the risk of damage occurring to those people as those profiles are lost, given the increased level of detail, I think it's very different to the past, where it was only a couple of attributes for one person. Now these are quite detailed profiles, and I think what we've seen over the past decade is if you collect profiles, data, and you think you can keep it safe, you are mistaken. It will be lost. And the damage to those people who've been profiled, I think, will be substantially more than we've seen in the past.
I guess we're talking about different things. I guess you are talking about client or profiles in Facebook or so, because for banking industry, it's very important to, client profiling is a risk management tool. So banks use client profiles all day, and this is something that data analytics, a good client profile helps you prevent unusual behavior from the client in financial transactions that banks are by law required to report to financial intelligence units and authorities. So client profiles can also be a good thing if you take it from a risk management approach for financial, crime purposes. And then, I mean, I guess we agree probably it's how you use these client profiles. It's just for detect suspicious transactions and suspicious activity to report it to the authorities, or we are using elsewhere. But I mean, at the same time, banks have very strict data privacy laws. So
I should say, I am not speaking about Facebook. Those same profiles that are collected by banks, yes, they can be used for good purposes. They can also be lost and used for bad purposes. Now, I keep a very close eye on the price at which profiles are sold on the dark web. I'm thinking about medical records, but they could easily be banking records if banks do not keep those records safe. Mm-hmm. And as we continue to amass this data and these profiles and increase the size of them, if we don't have some way in which to destroy the data, they will eventually be lost. And as I said, depending on how they're used, the damage can be quite great to those people who are involved.
And just one comment on this about the profile discussion. Yeah, I think there is two ways to look at profile. There's sort of the top-down way where I know who you are and your name and your age and your race. And then there's also the data-driven one, which is what I deal a lot with, which is all I know about you is what you do, your behavioral traces. But I think one of the I guess, new concerns, especially, is not just the data in terms of medical records, you're John Doe and this is your medical history. It's the knowledge or the information that we can infer from multiple data sets as we start to link them together. So you don't have to tell me your friend is Jack. I can infer your friend is Jack. So that power that is provided to us by modern computational methods makes this issue even more compelling and necessary to discuss.
What do you think, the public needs to understand about big data? I mean, I think a lot of them look at it as kind of a black box, and if anything, they worry because of the Snowden stuff that they're being continually spied on. You may also worry that, your data is being used to always flog new articles, new things to spend your money on. I mean, what worries? How should we deal with public worries?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's one that should be more in the public eye, or more of an open discussion. I love reading people's responses to this question, and I read one yesterday, reading a review of the new Amazon device that's always on and has a camera on it. And I love comment sections and these discussing this, because half the people are saying how great it is, and half the people are saying you're crazy for putting this device in your home that can constantly record you. So I think in general, I think over the past couple of years, people have become more aware that data is being collected, and it certainly affects their level of trust in companies or organizations that are collecting the data. But I don't think the general public has a good understanding of what that data is being used for, nor do they understand that I guess the power is ours as a population to really push policy to put restrictions on that usage, because I don't think there is enough of that right now.
On another hand, big data analytics, for example, can be very helpful in predictive bad clients' behavior in trade-based money laundering, where you have complex transactions, international, global, fragmented, supervised by different national authorities. So big data platforms can be very helpful to analyze data and to predict suspicious transactions. In the case of as Benjamin pointed, I mean, in the case of the Philadelphia port, I mean, you can also use big data analytics for trade-related issues that can be very, very helpful. So, and Barry also talking about the dangers of big data. I think it's very important also to analyze RegTech and the regulation and technology. Yeah. New tools that have very positive potential applications for financial supervisors, distributed ledgers technology that are quite transparent, and then I think where the data is distributed in a ledger, and also both the clients are participants and the banks, and you can even provide access to financial supervisors, and there are certain financial supervisors that embrace really this technology, like Giancarlo, for example, the CFTF commissioner here, and that has mentioned that in several public speeches. I mean, I think this distributed ledger technologies for supervising trading and settlements of securities where also after the Lehman fall, we saw that it was very difficult to know where the swaps were distributed around the globe. That can be very interesting to help financial supervisors in future.
Great. Benjamin, last words?
Yeah, sure. I do some work with reinsurers, so forgive me if I kind of always am looking at the risks here. On the one hand, I would say to people, I actually say to people that it's quite reassuring because we've gone through rapid periods of technological change in the past, and we've managed to come out of it, but we're still here. But I would just urge people to think very carefully about what information is being collected and what could be done with it. I sometimes use the example, if you'd gone back to people when they started putting lead in petrol, it was seen as a wonderful thing because the engines would run better. Then we found that, well, it lets out this exhaust that contains lead, and lead is damaging, especially to young children's cognitive abilities. There are downsides to technological change if we don't price them in and we don't put in place public policies that are able to mitigate some of those downsides. So I would just urge people in this very exciting data age, it's big data, but it creates, because it's by virtue of its scale, it creates big problems, big feedback mechanisms, and that requires big solutions. And that's really what we have to come up with, not just at a national level here in the United States, but I think as your chapter amply shows, internationally, given that it is an inherently transnational phenomenon.
Great. Thank you again, and thank you for your work on the report. It's been superb. We're going to change panels here. I don't want the audience to get up. I just want the panelists here to get up, and then we'll bring on a new group of panelists. But thank you so much. It's been great.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Mics are on now. Good. So good morning, everyone. We will probably be joined in progress by our other panelists, but we're all really excited to be up here. My name's Todd Rosenblum, and with me are Channing May and Bob Shukai. Did I pronounce that right, Bob? Yep. Okay, good. Yeah. And what we're going to try to do is set the scene a little bit about describing the threat itself and some of the trends in the tools. And I know you talked a little bit about that in the opening. And I think okay, so we've got our other one coming. Good. And I hope everyone had a chance to look at the report, which is really a tremendous job and goes into some good detail both on the opportunities and constraints. But I wanted to take advantage of our panelists today who've got some real terrific backgrounds and insights and just have a conversation. So let me do some quick introductions. Immediately to my left is Channing May. She's a policy analyst at Global Financial Integrity. And she released a report in March 2017 called Transnational Crime in the Developing World. And it explores 11 different criminal markets, their value, the dynamics, impacts in developing countries, and on recent developments. So we'll have a chance to go into that. And dramatically making it to the stage now.
Hi, sorry about that.
Hey, how you going, man? No worries.
My apologies all.
Is Juan Zarate. Juan doesn't do well in traffic. That's the first thing on his
For
intro.
sure. It's DC, man.
Wow.
Yeah. Juan's the chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network. He's also the former Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism for President George W. Bush. Juan serves as chairman, as I mentioned. He's chairman and senior advisor for the Foundation of Defense of Democracies for the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, as well as his other position. And he is a senior national security analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and is a senior fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. And Bob Shukai, he's the global head of design and digital identity solutions for Thomson Reuters, and he oversees the development and execution of mobile growth strategy and leads central technology innovation function for Thomson Reuters globally. His focus areas include cognitive computing, machine learning, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, financial technology, fintech, blockchain, which we'll talk a little bit about, user experience and data visualization. So as you can see, we've got a really terrific group here. And what I want to do is kick off by asking each of our panelists a question, and we'll have a little back and forth, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So we're looking forward to this. And Channing, I think I'll begin with you in the questions. If you could help set the stage for us on what's going on in the world of organized crime in terms of trends, patterns. If you could talk a little about who's making money and how they're doing it. Is the problem getting worse? Is it staying the same? Are we getting a little bit better at getting on top of it? And also, are we making any headway, or what headway are we making, I should say, in public-private sector collaboration in combating this threat?
Sure. So thank you all for having us here today. Transnational crime, so we just released a report, and it looks at 11 transnational criminal markets. So drug trafficking, arms, humans, human organs, cultural property, wildlife trafficking, counterfeiting, illegal fishing, illegal logging, illegal mining, and crude oil theft. So, most of it's there. There's a few more that we weren't able to cover. That had to keep me on a short leash because I love going down that rabbit hole and looking and analyzing the data. And one of the biggest things that I realized or was really hammered home to me doing this was just how much this is a business, and that it's almost exclusively profit-motivated crimes, and we need to keep that in the forefront of our mind when it comes to how we tackle these crimes. We have the tendency to look at criminal groups with kind of an emotional lens of this good versus evil and treat them a little differently, kind of in the idea that they're all like The Godfather, that we're all hierarchical organizations, that we take off the head, kind of like the Hydra, we take off the head and it's going to be okay, except 5 more heads pop up. So it's thinking about how do we go after the heart, how do we really target what's going on. And an example I like to give is to think about what would you do if you wanted to shut down a multinational corporation? Because there's a lot of groups out there, particularly cartels in Mexico, that really do a great job of making it look like a business with the diversification of what they're doing, the professionalization of what they're doing, even the corporate responsibility of getting communities to at least go along with it. So I like to think about Apple. And for me, one of the most common techniques to fighting transnational organized crime is to go after the products. It's great, it's visible, but it's also like trying to shut down Apple by going after individual iPhones. It's often an exercise in futility of going after these individual products, either a dime bag of cannabis or even tons of pangolin scales, and maybe you get lucky, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much of a divot into what they're doing. Also popular is going after low-level participants. So you have your street-level retailer, you have your illegal miner, your artisanal miner, or a poacher, which a lot of times these people are acting out of economic necessity. Nobody grows up wanting to be a drug dealer, maybe a pirate, but not a drug dealer. They're doing it because of what it affords them, not because of the activity itself is that great. So it would be like going into the Apple store in Georgetown and arresting all the employees. Like you've immediately stopped the sale of a bunch of products, but they'll just hire a bunch of more people who need jobs. And then the most, I think, obvious one is going after the head. Really popular decapitation techniques. Look at Steve Jobs. After he died, there was no huge impact on the company. They already had a very strong brand with products that were in very high demand. So it's a matter of looking at organized crime as a business and thinking about systemically what is supporting this. And for us, for myself and for my colleagues at Global Financial Integrity, it's about looking at the money and the global shadow financial system that supports it. So things particularly like anonymous shell companies and secrecy jurisdictions, trade-based money laundering, things like that, so that we're not just looking at drugs, we're looking at human trafficking, or we're looking at wildlife. Criminals don't discriminate. So if they can move one product, they'll move another. It's not like, I'll do heroin, but human trafficking is a little bit, it crosses that moral line for me. It's not like that. So we need to think about what can we target at a systemic level to combat transnational crime. In terms of what we're seeing coming from civil society and other groups, give a little plug out to Global Financial Integrity. We have a product we've developed called GF Trade. It's a risk-based proprietary application that enables customs officials to look at a product on an invoice and determine whether or not it's priced outside typical ranges for comparable goods, which can be a strong indicator of trade misinvoicing and trade-based money laundering. And for us, it's a matter of stopping the money before it leaves. There's a lot of efforts now you see in Nigeria or India at asset recovery, and those can be extremely difficult. So before it leaves, what can we do to stop it now and ask the right questions? It's not about big data making the decisions. We have data from 30 different countries that is used, just the US alone is 10 million transactions per month. It's there to help inform us about our decisions, but still have that human element there to help us with that.
It's really helpful. It's interesting. So, essentially, you've got graft, you've got running pirated CDs and whatnot off production lines, and you have organized crime, and there is a spectrum, as you're talking about. And Juan, I want to turn to you to put it in the context of the size and scale of the threat. Are we looking at a existential threat to the institutions, global institutions, and to governance writ large? Is this a law enforcement issue to be managed? Where do you see the impacts on institutions being most significant?
It's a great question. I'm honored to be here. Sorry again for being a little bit late. Handle terrorists better than traffic. But I think Channing has it right in terms of the scope. I think the scope of organized crime is much more global. And before answering your question directly, I think there are three elements to kind of how this is evolving that are important that then get to the question of what the real risk is. One has to do with the globalization of organized crime. The fact that these groups, especially the high-end organized dimensions of them, not only can use whatever form of trade to profit, but are organized in ways that really do make them look like multinationals and allow them to use the implements of the global financial and commercial system, whether it's shipping, banking, or insurance to their benefit, and very much not localized in a classic way that you would think of the Italian mafia or the Japanese yakuza sort of in one geography or in one market. This is much more globalized, and we've seen this over and over again. You saw this with the King Midas case out of Mexico, $4 billion of money laundering over the course of a decade using shell companies, multiple bank accounts, multiple trade routes, very sophisticated, right? So there's a globalization to this. There's a blending and less categorization around these groups, unlike at any time before in history. So you've got groups that are terrorist groups like Hezbollah, operating like multinational criminal organizations. We've seen this with the DEA and Treasury actions against what's called now the Business Affairs Council of Hezbollah, which runs drug trafficking operations, money laundering operations in South America, West Africa, through Europe and into the Levant. And so there's a blending of these groups to include state actors, and we've seen this with North Korea historically, the mafia state as it's often called. And third, the use of new implements, right? So you've got the use of cyber capabilities in ways that are allowing not only new markets to open up, like we saw with Silk Road or Liberty Reserve, but also the ability to profit. We've seen this with the North Koreans, the WannaCry malware attack, a great example. Even the very market around ransomware itself is a profit-making venture for these groups in these in the deep web and in these dark marketplaces. So that in of itself is very different in scope, and it's giving access to capital, access to markets, access to all sorts of capabilities globally, and it's allowing groups to meld their operations. Where the threat lies then depends on kind of the spectrum, and so you have classic law enforcement threats, obviously. In many cases, you have to deal with these issues at a local level. Sometimes you do have to arrest the employees, right? You've got to do the disruption on the ground. But often it looks like a national security issue. Again, Hezbollah is a good example, or where you have Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb looking like smuggling organizations in the Maghreb. That's a national security issue. Where you have the power of these groups growing to such an extent that they can challenge not just organized government, but actually take over civil society, that becomes a major challenge. So in places like Mexico or Afghanistan, the great concern is that these groups, in essence, overtake governance and overtake society in fundamental ways. Eastern Europe, that's a major issue in terms of corruption. And so that's a systemic problem. And then when you talk about the very profit-making ventures themselves, where you talk about cyber threats, and again, the North Koreans are a good example, where not only are these profit-making sort of ventures, but they're on the brink of being systemically disruptive, if not destructive. And so if you look at the Bank of Bangladesh case, where you had $81 million siphoned off, believed to be by the North Koreans through Philippine casinos, systemically relevant case, a case that involved profit-making and fraud, et cetera, the use of the financial system, but really a canary in the coal mine in terms of the potential systemic risk that this very same actors that were trying to profit from that fraud could turn those same tools in a destructive way to potentially even destroy the bank messaging system that the entire system relies upon. And so to answer your question, you have a full spectrum of risk, all the way from the law enforcement on the ground challenges, protecting forests, wildlife, humans, disrupting slave labor, all of that, all the way to the high-end systemic. And part of that is driven by the opportunities in the system that these groups are taking advantage of.
Just quick follow-up on that. Certainly when I was inside, we were always assessing the potential nexus, especially on our southern border, of terrorist organization cooperation with the organized criminal organizations. And the perspective certainly that I had was that the profit-making imperative of the criminal organizations viewed a terrorist connection as bad for business. But if you could talk a little bit about your view, not necessarily particularly on that one potential nexus, but elsewhere, and also on the relationship of organized crime to the hacktivists and the political activist community.
Yeah.
Do you see that as an emerging trend, or where we might be going there?
It's a fascinating question, because I think the orthodoxy has been that contrary ideologies don't allow for cooperation or collaboration, and I think that's somewhat wrong. I think that's wrong in the sense that these aren't groups that are necessarily trying to align themselves theologically, ideologically for the long term, right? It's not like the Zetas, in thinking about some of the plazas and corridors they want to control, are going to take an ideological litmus test to determine what the millennial view is of their counterparty, right? So I think we've assumed too much around the ideological end states of these groups, not just between criminals and terrorists, but also between terrorist groups themselves. I often like to remind folks that the Treasury Department has laid bare a lot of the relationships between the senior al-Qaeda elements that have remained in Iran, who continue to funnel money in and through Iran, despite the fact that it's very clear that Iran and al-Qaeda are at war with each other and ideologically diametrically opposed, right? So I think we've got to be careful about assuming too much about ideological alliance and look more to the transactional opportunity that these groups envision for themselves. So along the southern border, you have the challenge of special interest aliens, who aren't asked for their ideological ID card when they're asked or asking to sort of be smuggled into the country or are engaged in all sorts of criminal activity, whether it's in Mexico, Central America, or into the United States. When you look at the smuggling networks in West Africa, again, these are groups that really aren't ideologically aligned, but they've done business with each other. And to the point made earlier, this is about profit. This is about profit, opportunity, and logistics. You look at the wildlife trafficking networks in East Africa. You've got elements of drug networks out of South Asia. You've got militant groups, to include the Lord's Resistance Army in the area, along with profiteers, all sort of taking advantage of wildlife trafficking. So I think we've got to be careful about assuming too much around the ideological barriers to cooperation, and look to, and frankly, this is why financial information is so important, look to see where those relationships actually lie. What do the money trails actually tell us about the relationships between what would seem to be odd bedfellows, but at the end of the day become marriages of convenience for profit? So I think we've got to be careful about our assumptions.
Bob, let me turn to you, and this is where everyone needs to start to look at this nexus we have between the mission space, the countering mission itself, and now the tools, the technology that has been used, is being used, and is being developed. And my own sense is that we still pretty much have two different worlds. And what I mean by that is, for example, this long expose in the Washington Post last week about the Russian interference. One of my key takeaways from the article was how much the deliberations stayed among the cyber community. And so in a sense in the functional world, and then the regional world wasn't brought in. And so this is why I want to begin this discussion talking about mission, and now turning more to technology, and then I want to bring it back again. So for those who live in mission space, this gets intimidating, and for those who live in technology space, the mission I know gets a little
Don't worry.
intimidating. So I live now in the tech world, but after a career of being completely non-tech. So Bob, talk a little bit about, this conference today is around big data, and big data means a lot to a lot of different people. The potential, its use, its application, its potential for abuse, its potential for opportunity. But I think one of the most important variables that I'd like you to hit on, as well as talking a little bit about the tech, is both its strength and its limitations for addressing these challenges.
Sure. So you can probably tell I'm not from DC. It's either the hair from the 80s or the t-shirt. I'm not sure which.
You look comfortable.
I am comfortable. I am comfortable. You know, I build stuff. And so, you know, when I see reports and policy, it's all good because it's a lot of talk and it's a lot of recommendation. But the rubber hits the road when you actually go to build real things to prove this stuff out to solve real problems. So Benjamin, I think, set it up exceptionally well. We've been in this amazing technology change over the last 20 years with the explosion of the internet and the cheap nature of compute. The price of compute has just dropped, enabling us to do amazing, amazing things. And everything that tech can do is probably 10 to 15 years ahead of where law, policy sits. And so for everything great that I can do in technology, there's a bad guy who's going to do something equally as bad. And that's why we sit here and we have these incredible struggles, right? Big data, you know, I look at it and go, big data is nice, it's a buzzword, it's great, it's interesting, but the only thing that matters about big data is what's that small component, what's that one piece of information that solves the problem I care about. I don't care about the terabytes and zettabytes and gigabytes and servers all over the world holding all this stuff unless it contains the information that's relevant to solving the exact problem I have. And we think, you know, there's a panacea of machines taking over the world and artificial intelligence solving every problem, but that is not the case. These machines have to be trained and have to understand the language of what they're actually looking for, as Benjamin alluded to. You know, we've been building stuff in the cognitive computing sphere for quite a while, and what you saw, for example, with IBM and Watson and Jeopardy, it reads Wikipedia really well, but go ask it to find some terrorist sending money from, you know, a country in the Middle East to somewhere in Southeast Asia, and it's going to struggle. In fact, it's probably not going to find the answer that you're looking for. So a lot of what we actually have here is a fundamental tension between, and again, I think the panel addressed this absolutely brilliantly. Technology can solve a lot of problems, but if we can't figure out the rules of the road, and the rules of the road consist of how do we address privacy, how do we address information sharing? Because a big problem that we had, and you saw this in the report last week, that came out in the Cipher brief, but it's similar to, you know, the story in Russia. Intel services struggle to share information with the private sector. They struggle to share information amongst themselves. Why? Because they may potentially blow the cover of the mission. And back to what Channing says, if you want to decapitate, going after the low-level guy doesn't solve your problem. One of the projects we're actually doing right now with 8 FIUs in Southeast Asia, and there's a reason we picked Southeast Asia that I think Benjamin will really appreciate, is we're looking at how can we share information amongst these countries without violating those laws. And we think the mechanism to do it is to build an identity platform, because fundamentally it's people. People are behind nefarious transactions. People are behind companies. It's people who commit bad stuff. And if we can find a mechanism for sharing amongst these countries by sending at least flags of warning, maybe I can't send the information itself, but I can send you a red flag or an amber flag so that you as the human being can ask a couple of more questions. We actually have an opportunity to go and solve this. It's not a project I can take to the EU. Why? Because they have this new data privacy law coming in with GDPR. They have privacy laws that prevent this stuff. But there's a vested interest in these countries led by Austrac, who I think are one of the most innovative, most progressive FIUs in the world, who are prepared to work with other countries and who are prepared to try and build real stuff to solve problems. And that's what you need to do. You can't just talk, you can't just put it in a paper. You got to build real things, and you got to figure out how can we build that sphere of cooperation to live with the laws that exist, but understand what we can legitimately share to solve some problems.
So, Bob, as a quick follow-up to that, what's your view on the idea that the bad guys are going to remain ahead because they don't take technology and have to apply it at the enterprise level, whereas the good guys always have to work within a larger institution? And as you mentioned, the rule set on sharing and all the very legitimate protections we put in place, whether it's on personally identifiable information or just agreements, that on this sort of offense-defense race, the bad guys are going to remain more agile.
So they are gonna, and this is always going to be a cat and mouse game. You know, look at what used to be the norm for conducting major terrorist operations. You'd be sending money all over God's green earth to conduct these massive let's take an airplane down, right? Nowadays, it takes $50 to hire a van and run up over a curb and kill a bunch of people in London, in France, in any place in the world. And when you look at the method in which we can move money so simply these days, so easily. You know, Facebook, there's 2 billion people on Facebook, and Facebook has this amazing peer-to-peer ability to move money around, and yet Facebook has somewhere between 5 to 14% of their profiles that are fake or bogus. Who's looking at the $20 transactions, the $50 transactions, the $100 transactions? These are lost in the noise. And that's fundamentally the problem that we're going to have. They are always going to be able to stay away because the tactics change, and it's an asymmetric battle that we're fighting. This is why I think you've got to go, just like Channing said, and think about how you take down these people as a business. I think you got to think about identity in very different ways than we've thought about it before. We used to always think about it as, well, it's my biometrics and my DNA, or maybe it's my legal identity. No, it's also your social media profile. It's also your behavioral component, how you spend, how you travel, where you go, who you interact with. It does start to border on these things called profiling and things like that, but you gotta have the discussion, and we're gonna have to make this fundamental trade, I think, between how much do we value national security and protection versus how much do we want to behave in a free society. The number of times you're captured on camera in London or across the UK is a staggering amount, right? It's staggering in New York City. We don't have it so much in Atlanta, Georgia. We don't have quite the problem, right? And that is fundamentally part of the discussion we're just going to have and be honest about it.
So as part of that discussion, Juan, talk about the going dark challenge for organized crime. I think everyone's very familiar with the arguments in the counterterrorism world. What the reality is of the challenge itself, and it is a trade-off issue. Is it the same sort of trade-off issue that the going dark, meaning the peer-to-peer encryption networks that law enforcement is not able to get inside of? Is it as a significant challenge in countering organized criminal activity as it is in the counterterrorism world?
I think the answer is yes and no. I think the tools of anonymity, the attempts, greater individual autonomy around movement of money, peer-to-peer transfers of value, all cut against the grain of transparency, accountability, traceability, which are the hallmarks of the sort of current anti-money laundering system and the current sort of Bank Secrecy Act system from a U.S. perspective. And so there is a fundamental tension there to tools like Dark Wallet that are intended purposely to hide identity, hide transfers, hide behaviors, to not allow authorities then to understand where there may be illicit activity or illicit relationships or suspect behavior emerging. So yes, there is a fundamental challenge there, and part of that is a bit of the encryption, part of it is this trend toward anonymized services, part of it is this sort of autonomous way that financial services are evolving. So that's one layer. Where I don't think it's exactly the same is that in the context of movement of funds or transfer of value, at the core of that is the need to actually verify counterparties, the need to actually establish systems or ecosystems of trust. And so in that, you actually have to come up with, even if it's not traditional forms of identity validation, you have to create an ecosystem where the counterparties can actually trust that the value will actually move, that the money will be transferred, that they can then access whatever they're bargaining for. And so there's an inherent advantage in that, right? And we've seen this in the blockchain debate, right? The debate around Bitcoin and blockchain 4 years ago, and I had these debates in major global banks in their boardrooms where, it was, Bitcoin, anything Bitcoin blockchain was anathema. Now you can't shake a stick at a bank that hasn't invested in blockchain technology and that isn't announcing some innovation around blockchain. Why? Because the underlying blockchain technology is seen as actually an assured ledger system that allows for not only more efficient payments or trade finance or FX trades, but also the ability to verify identities and to establish a core ecosystem where you can validate using these technologies. And so what was once seen as a technology that obfuscated identity or created opportunities for illicit activity is now being seen as an opportunity for creating trust, greater efficiency, and ecosystems of trade and payment. And so I'm a little less pessimistic in some ways because I think there are ways of thinking creatively around not only identity management, but transaction monitoring, behavior analysis that give us windows into where there may be suspect activity. And to the extent that we're aggregating data and applying better analytics to it, we're actually getting better windows into suspect activity than we have in the past.
I always wonder if we actually decided to get rid of paper currency and fully move to digital currency, what could we build in to that in terms of understanding who's behind it, who's spending it, what's it being spent on? Of course, it's very big brother, scare the hell out of a lot of people in the room, I'm sure, scare the people that are worried about privacy. But that movement, that's already starting to happen. You go to the Nordics, and it is basically a cashless society these days. And the Aussies are talking about it. There's a lot of people talking about what would happen if we actually moved in that way. Take the paper out of the chain, make it digital, because you can get that greater transparency around the transaction.
Yeah, there's fascinating work in that area, even in extraordinarily large nations like India.
Yeah.
As they're trying to do that.
They're
Channing,
doing
let me ask you finally, and then we'll open it up to questions. Talk about the challenge of applying some of these tools to institutions, whether it's in the banking sector or the public sector. Do you see, there's some obviously some extraordinary tools out there, and the lab work, is always 100% successful because it's a controlled environment. But when you go outside that and go to organizations, are you seeing improvement in user interface? Are you seeing people more flexible on adapting to new tools as they come out?
I can't say I go too much to look at these institutions, but something that comes to mind, and not to tread too much on the next panel, is the issue with SARS, with suspicious activity reports and currency transactions reports, because they generate such large volumes that are based on gathering big data and turning that into information. Because I think, as a side note, there's some people just think that big data is the answer. Like, that's going to give it to you. It's just going to tell you what to do. But there's a difference between big data or data in general and information. And so having either pre or post SAR or CTR depends on a little bit of the regulation and what's allowed, but what can be done in terms of machine learning for suspicious activities, what can be done to look for patterns and trends, particularly when it comes to such large organizations where, this is not your local credit union. You're not going to just pick up and notice some kind of change in, for example, like structuring or smurfing. But if you have that kind of overarching algorithms in there that are allowing a program or an application to learn and for you to help it to learn, because it's not like Bob said, it's not going to be this is information and then you figure it out. You have to teach it. It's a child, and so you have this learning curve, and so it's deciding how to teach the machine and what to the information to give it. There's also the issue of what comes from it. So you get all these SARs and CTRs kicked out, but then you still have a bunch of people that have to go through them and decide, is this relevant to look at it? So it's difficult. I think things like WorldCheck are very helpful. It's a tool that's put out by Thomson Reuters to help screen for Know Your Customer. And it's really great for PEPs, and I think it has a lot of great applications. We're looking to use it as an NGO in some of our research. I think it's primarily targeted to financial institutions and governments, but for us, we see a lot of ability to use that in doing research on illegal fishing and looking at the structures behind some of these groups, particularly the use of anonymous shell companies, which the Panama Papers came out and I think what was really cool about the Panama Papers was that it was a group of individuals that kind of were handed like 11 million files. And they were able to come up with a system to extract the data, because it's not just screening Microsoft Word. Extract the data and then process it and then sort it and then analyze it and then present it. I think was one of the coolest parts, which is similar to WorldCheck, is having these nodal networks and showing how these things are connecting, which was super important for the general public to understand. I remember being back in the day oh, what do you do? Okay, we look at anonymous shell companies. We look at beneficial ownership, and it's like, oh, okay, that's cool. Don't know what that means. But now, saying, okay, the Panama Papers, people can recognize and associate that, and really there's a strong connection for them to be able to see why there is a security issue when it comes to anonymous shell companies. And in the U.S., you have to provide more information to get a library card than you do to register a company. And for me, from a security point of view, that has a much stronger issue than any privacy that could be out there. There's a discussion about having public ledgers of ownership or private, as long as it's there. I mean, right now, it's not a matter of not having access to the information. It's not there who owns these companies. So there's so much data to be culled together and really can be helped to inform and help law enforcement too in all of this.
I think we have about 10, 15 minutes left, so why don't we turn to some questions, and if it's okay with the panelists, we'll take 2 questions at a time. So let's begin. I saw a hand over here first, and then we'll go over there.
Yes. I have a question about the conflict between the global and the national in the context of the discussion that we're having, because this whole discussions are big data. In this context, I think we're talking about global big data. And the processes that we're talking about are outcomes of our national processes. So designation of a group as a terrorist is a national political outcome, because we're silent about other groups that do a lot worse things in the world. Or the issue of blockchain, we're talking about the introduction of a ledger system and a currency that is global and international, outside the control of national governments. So as these processes go against each other, what is the implication for the national political process in all of this? We talk about technology trends and so on, but what does it mean for our policymakers and politicians?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Essentially, the challenge of digital currency to national and international institutions. And we had another question here we'll take.
Hi, I'm Paul Gilmore. I help the Army analyze big data for logistics support. My question pertains to that culture of the military world, which also relates to the business world and other elements. In the counterterrorism world, we accept explanations like the chatter is up. There's a correlation between two things that the mind doesn't always see, obviously, but when chatter is up here, something bad is going to happen over here. Let's act. Now, in a tactical and strategic defense culture, it's prove it to me, soldier. Run it to ground. Do your homework. Show me the data before I commit combat resources into something you can't tell me is for real. Likewise in the business world. Before I invest in this, prove it to me. Can you see a cultural change in both defense and our national culture where we're willing to accept correlation of things we don't normally see related that lets us act proactively? Thank you.
So the questions are on Minority Report. Why don't we quickly, whoever would like to take?
Yeah.
Who would like to take on the question?
How about if I start with yours real quick?
Yeah.
So, absolutely agree with you. Predictive analytics, I think, is a key to solving this exact challenge you're talking about. It's about disconnected points that you can bring together and go exactly as you say, chatter's up, we know something bad is going to happen. The way technology operates and the way we all try to operate these days, I think is much different than it was before, where I'm waiting for that exact answer. And most of this stuff that we're talking about, even down to how you're trying to prove who people are, how you do searches, how you look at things. We've gone from looking for exact matches to fuzzy matches, right? Imagine trying to solve the problem of, is it this Jim Smith or this Mr. Lee that's conducting a bad transaction? That's a really, really tough thing to do, right? And technology is probably not going to be able to answer that problem. But if technology can take the 144 Jim Smiths or John Smiths and get it down to 20, we've made your life a little bit easier. And I think that's the nature of this data explosion that we have to expect. 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, did you ever see the Simpsons episode? Because the Simpsons predict everything in life, right? Do you remember where they show, I think it's an NSA call center, all listening in on calls, and somebody stands up and goes, I got one, I finally got one. It was Lisa and Marge on the run. That ability to find that one needle in the haystack is pretty freaking rare these days. So it is exactly what you're saying of you're looking for patterns, you're looking for non-traditional ways to make decisions, because the prove it to me, by the time you prove it, it's too late.
I think.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think also it's kind of getting the culture to change a little bit about understanding, as I mentioned earlier, that just because you have all of this data doesn't mean it's going to spit out, this like little ticket that's like, okay, here are his coordinates and go get them. So it's making them understand that data is there to help inform our decisions. You still need the human element, and you need a little bit of trust. But you also, it's not there to make the decisions, which would be a little scary. Then we get to the Minority Report territory. So it's getting, I think a lot of it's just getting, there still isn't even a strong definition of big data. So getting people to understand what it is and then how it can be used. And it's looking for the patterns and looking, it's like giving an educated guess, which is not always what is desired maybe in the military sphere.
Juan, do you want to take on also the digital currency?
I just want to touch on this very quickly because it's a really important question, and I think there's a couple factors that are pushing in this direction. One is the predictive analytics and the sense of what's possible in terms of understanding how data can help inform decisions. But you see this happening in other contexts, and so you have local police forces using hotspot technology to try to inform where they put patrols, et cetera, to try to identify with even greater and greater granularity where crime rates may happen. Now, there's a big debate in legal circles around implied bias, embedded bias, et cetera, but still interesting that in local domestic law enforcement, you have this idea of applying resources in ways that rely on data to actually be a bit more predictive. So there's already in the sort of in the atmosphere, a sort of a practice to use this. The other thing that I think is interesting is when you talk about autonomous weapon systems, you have a fundamental question of defensive and offensive use. Again, major legal debates about the norms and laws and the needs for human intervention. But what's interesting there is there's a debate, as we've seen in the intel community, around levels of confidence and proof in the context of what then triggers decisions and the engineering behind these systems. And so embedded in the DoD world is going to be this fundamental question of what level of proof, what level of evidence do you need to be able to action off of information you have, whether it's deployment of troops or the use of Aegis defense systems. That debate's already upon us, right? So I think all of these are elements in the environment that are going to force a bit more creative thinking in the DoD world around how you do this. Just quickly on the national global question, I think there's already this inherent tension when you talk about the global financial system, right? There are global norms, global actors, the SWIFT system, all of which are bound by national laws, but are really about international relationships and flows of capital. Where I see this most sort of coming into play is where you have the need for greater information sharing across borders, even within enterprises. One enterprise but that has global remit and global exposure, but those institutions bound by national laws that don't allow for information sharing. So there are international norms, for example, that require enterprise-wide risk assessments. What does that mean? It means an entity, a big global bank like JP Morgan, has to understand where its risk lies. Therefore, it has to have access to information about what's happening in its system. But it's bound by laws, national laws, that actually restrict how that information can flow and how it can be analyzed, how it can be moved, et cetera. So there are already inherent challenges in a global financial system with multinationals bound by national laws. And I think it's only going to be exacerbated in this environment because the desire is to try to pool more data. I think that the opportunity here is to come up with technologies that actually respect national laws and boundaries, allow you to access that data, but may not require you to move it, or may not require you to access the sensitive parts of the data that actually create the tension with the national law. So I think here technology is going to be an enabler to kind of split the baby between that international desire to share information and data and the national desire to protect it and even to house it within jurisdictions.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I liken it to the I want to go and buy beer at my public supermarket. And to do that, I have to pull out this driver's license. Immediately, I'm already exposing more information than is absolutely necessary for that beer purchase. What do they need, actually? They need a date of birth, they need a photo that looks something like me, and they need to know that this Georgia driver's license I have is valid. Everything else on here, they don't need. They don't need my name. They don't need my height. They don't need my weight. They don't need my address, right? So what part of the challenge you're describing is, it's at a national level. It's how countries like India, Indonesia, Singapore have decided we're going to create central databases of identity for our people. You never get away with that in the US, UK, Australia, where we protect our information so much, and yet we're also the product, right? Because we freely put it out there to access loads and loads of services on the basis of, well, this makes my life convenient, who cares?
Bob, you're by saying that, I'm going to try to stay disciplined, but that's a conversation I have some strong views on, and there's some real vulnerabilities that we're creating, and we are all willfully accepting simply by clicking, I agree with these terms of agreement, which, by the way, usually have a clause in there that says they have the right to change the terms of agreement every time you do an update. That's,
read those 53 pages.
Yeah. Another round of questions over here, and we'll do one more, Eddie, and a question in the back there.
Hi, my name is Ted Mormon. I have two conversations I had recently that I'd like to get some comments on. One was with a regulator who was looking at suspicious activity reports, and I was kind of astonished at how many reports there were, and the fact that there wasn't any kind of data analytics going into it to prioritize these reports. She had to read every single report, and I asked, well, why can't you get somebody to kind of analyze this stuff? Well, we don't have the resources to do that. And the other conversation was with a financial consultant to a bank. And I asked him, what were you looking to do for the bank? And he said, we were looking at the bank's ability to detect suspicious activity. And what we found is that the bank had 95% false positives, which means they were getting way too many hits that weren't legitimate. And he said, what we found out is that the bank really didn't want us to kind of decrease that number of false positives. They just wanted us to, speed up the process after we got the false positives and actually kind of, which is a more laborious process. And so I guess it looks like there are burdens on regulators and the regulated, and the question is, can big data actually solve those problems? Is there hope for it, or are there limitations to big data? Just
two things with that, and then we'll go to the question and other answers. There's some interesting, real significant, interesting developments in the tech world, and one is on natural language processing, which is improving the machine's understanding to get nuance out of words, therefore to become better, more accurate. And second is the concept of neural networks, where basically it's an approach where machines are going away from a binary yes/no to one where this is probably right, and then we'll go to the next box and it says, yeah, I think this is also probably right, which is the way the human brain actually works. So there's sort of some real promise in terms of improving the actual application of these tools to real world situations. But let's go to the question over here.
Hi, Louisa. So I listen to FinCast, and one of the issues that often comes up is the burden of compliance for sort of the majority of companies out there, individuals, smaller banks. And so my question kind of tacks on to the question just asked, which is, for those companies or banks that are willing to do maybe voluntary disclosures beyond sort of what we view as maybe having privacy concerns, to what extent can big data or blockchain help create or facilitate good guy groups so that, these larger bad actors, yes, they're operating in the larger financial system, but for smaller groups that are bogged down by all the controls, if they're willing to provide extensive information or beneficial ownership or what have you, can that be incentivized so that you're further isolating the bad actors, but not creating such a burden of compliance that, fewer, let's say, SMEs in emerging markets are able to operate on a global scale? So I'm just curious how you see technology kind of facilitating that.
Yeah, it's a good question. In a couple ways. So in government, for those of us who've had security clearances, we've all given up all of our rights to privacy, but it still is a challenge because the issue is sort of identifying the right data. And then I think another element of your question is if you clear away some of the obvious variables, the low-hanging fruit sort of things, is it going to be more successful in some of the emerging markets, for example, and in other contexts, to be more precise in the applications? So let me turn to the panel for answers.
So going for the first question, one of the issues I see is what data is being collected. And I don't think always, having worked at a bank before, there's always a strong sense, particularly when you're talking about like the front line of staff, of really knowing what data is worthwhile to take and what is worthwhile to report. And there's a kind of just a sense of, we'll take whatever we get, and just to be safe, we're going to fill out all the SARs in the world and all the CTR. CTR is a little bit easier. It's the SARs that can be a bit more difficult because it's...
Tell them what a CTR.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So currency transaction reports, you're required to report transactions, cash transactions over a certain threshold. Suspicious activity reports, it's just that, suspicious activity. So it's kind of whatever a bank teller, a member service agent, or somebody in the back office sees in terms of transactions. There's guidance for it, but there's still some onus left for the bank to decide how to do it themselves. And I think the financial institutions believe it's easier just to fill all of these out, regardless, and kind of, CYA, and then it's then all just pushed, the onus is pushed on to the regulators to decide they have to go through it then. So it's trying to maybe clarify what information should be taken in the first place and more guidance that way, as well as a little bit of balance about, like, let's not have this culture where we're just trying to push the onus off of onto each other about, well, it's off my desk, it's their desk, they deal with it now.
Let me give an analogy to your question. Do you travel internationally? Do you have global entry? Global entry is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I still can't believe our government only charges $100 for 5 years for that. They could charge me $500.
I completely agree.
Make it 1,000.
Okay,
I'd pay.
let's
Game changer.
not go there.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to tell them, raise it. Do you
Talk
have,
to Secretary
yeah, do you have
Kelly.
TSA pre-check? No, you're like crazy. Do you fly? Okay, I'm willing to give away any piece of information to make the airport experience simpler. When you come into the country, having global entry meant that I had to go sit with a Customs and Border Patrol agent. They took a picture of me. They've got my fingerprints. They've got my passport. They had an interview. They have everything they ever need. But in giving that away, that made it simple for me now when I come into the country to hit a kiosk and rapidly go through. Same thing, you get pre-check off the back of that. Why couldn't that system be applied across more countries? So now I've given that information to TSA, I've given that information to CBP, Department of State. Share that with the Five Eyes as a starting point. UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US. Now when I go to the UK, I don't have to stand on one of those stupid, horrible lines where people don't know what to do because Heathrow has this bizarro baggage scanning system. You could do exactly what you're describing, but it's not the technology that's the problem. It's governments agreeing how to share the information. How do you create consent so that I can pass my information to the Brits or to the Aussies or to the Canadians or the Kiwis? And how do I know that they're going to protect it in such a way that as a US citizen, that information won't go walkabout, won't get stored in some way where I get screwed down the road and my ID gets stolen?
Juan?
3 quick thoughts in response to both questions. Great questions, by the way.
It is a great
and
question.
I love Bob, man. Hang out with you.
Just don't raise the price of.
No, you can raise it. Seriously, I'll
I feel
write that
cooler
check.
sitting next to you, by the
Oh,
way.
dude, it's all good, man.
One thing that's happening in the private sector is because of cost, because of questions of sustainability and also effectiveness, the good guys are trying to get together. Cyber is affecting this too, right? The need to share more information about cyber vulnerabilities and threats is forcing actors to think about collectives or even utility models, right? We've written a bit about this. One example is a unified KYC, unified Know Your Customer, which is a version of what Bob's talking about, which a lot of jurisdictions are talking about. Some banks are trying to collectivize to say, look, if we're getting the same information from customer X, you're getting the same information from customer X. Let's just routinize it, put it in a common database, protect it obviously, and then we can all access it, right? We've just reduced a lot of cost, a lot of burden. We've now probably created some efficiencies and also ability to manage identity better. So there's already a sense of that. There's already a sense of, can we do this in a dynamic way? So in the UK, they've got the GIMLET, this joint money laundering sort of experiment between public-private. Let's find particular cases or issues where we can share information more dynamically. And that is a model that's now being replicated, and the banks are looking at that. A third thought, I think if we are still debating sort of the utility of a SAR or CTR next year or the year after, we've lost the forest for the trees, right? The new technologies allow us to imagine a very different system, right? I think we're on the verge of a completely different design for AML CFT that's built around closed systems and clearinghouses or even common utilities, either within a jurisdiction or between similarly situated institutions, where you can collect the data in a much more dynamic way. You can apply analytics to it. It's not magic, right? You've got to teach it. You can apply AI to it, and it then provides those institutions as well as authorities with a lot more information about systemic vulnerabilities that are, frankly, of much more use and of much more value from a law enforcement, national security, and systemic perspective. If we're hunting, SAR 1, SAR 2, SAR 3 come, 2020, we've missed the boat. And I think the big advantage here is that you've got a lot of folks experimenting. OSTRAC is on the leading edge. I think Bob's absolutely right to think about how do we collect real-time wire information, transfer information, collectivize it, add other data to enrich it, apply analytics on top of it, get the right partners and counterparties involved. Think about sharing it with the Five Eyes, and what do you see? You're going to see a lot more vulnerabilities. You're going to see higher-end vulnerabilities. You're going to get at the problems that we started the conversation about, and that's where you're going to get the advantage of technology. and then you're going to have to solve some of these legal issues. But if we're talking about SARs and CTRs in a couple years here on stage, please don't invite me.
Yeah.
I want to move the needle.
Yeah.
And if we do, by the way, we're going to send a car for you.
Please, thank you.
We've run out of time. This has been a terrific panel, and I hope you'll join me in giving them a round of applause. And we'll resume soon.
Thanks, man.
Great job.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. What? Oh, am I?
You're live.
I'm live. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so scary. Okay. I'll wait like 1 more minute. Okay. Yeah, on big data and crime, there's kind of this traffic jam now of all these different conflicting issues, all kind of slamming together at once. For one thing, there's obviously a greater need to be able to use data analysis and data processing to stop and predict crime and terrorism. But at the same time right now, you have, with the Snowden revelations and discomfort all around the world with U.S. intelligence and powerful corporations like Google, you're seeing more and more of a backlash. You're seeing more and more of national laws designed to protect data, or some would say silo it, and prevent it from being shared, even oftentimes with law enforcement, from different and allying countries. And then at the same time, in that mix right now, you have this thing of cryptocurrencies that are being increasingly used, and they're, in some ways, their biggest selling point is allowing the complete anonymity of users. And in some ways, that too has grown from this kind of backlash and feeling that people have about privacy. I'm joined today by 3 panelists. They all have a ton of experience to bring to this discussion about the use of big data in detecting crime and stopping crime and preventing acts of terrorism. You guys have their full bios, but I'll introduce them briefly now. Starting to my left is Mary Ellen Callahan, the Chair of Privacy, Information, and Governance at Jenner Block. Previously, she served as Chief Privacy Officer at Department of Homeland Security. In the middle is Leslie Ireland, a career intelligence officer serving the U.S. government for more than 30 years. Her most recent post was Assistant Secretary of Intelligence and Analysis at Treasury, where she was responsible for securing the nation's financial system. And finally, we have Bart van Liebergen. Bart is the Associate Policy Advisor at the Institute of International Finance and works on regulatory and intelligence issues. Previously, he was a senior economist in the Ministry of Finance in the Netherlands. So I thought a good question to start out with. The report looks at a lot of these emerging privacy and cross-border data flow rules, and again, a lot of these have kind of come to the fore, because of this sort of backlash about this perception that U.S. intelligence agencies are overreaching. But given that those laws are coming into place, how do corporate officers, government officials, investigators, how do they use the new data tools available to try to investigate and prevent acts of terror and crime?
You want to go first? Talk about the use of it, and then I'll talk about some of the privacy stuff?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, how do you navigate? The main question is, how do you navigate the emergence of all these cross-data border laws right now as you're seeking to use these new technologies?
Okay, so let me just say first off, obviously within the intelligence community, there are ways that information is shared. And there are ways that information is shared such that you build trust, you build confidence, and you have some assurances about how the information will be used or will not be used. That doesn't mean that you don't run smack into different data privacy sharing expectations. One area that I would make note of, and that has been both productive but has also run into some of the privacy concerns at times, is the Treasury Department has something called the TFTP, Terrorist Financing Tracking Program. And by virtue of the authorities of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, it can subpoena data that goes through the SWIFT network. SWIFT is a messaging system. About 85% of the world's transactions, global financial transactions on a daily basis, flow through SWIFT. And through that, SWIFT is Treasury is able to use that information to cull it for threatening transactions from a terrorist perspective. Where that's come into a challenge over time has been with European privacy concerns. And I tell you, one of the things that can be done, and that Treasury does on a regular basis with the European Union on that, is to, number one, show the value, to demonstrate specifically where that information has had a real role in stopping or helping in post-attack investigations. I think that's very critical. But also just being very sensitive and hearing out the privacy, and then giving some very frank conversations about how the information is handled, how it's stored, how it's used. So that would be just an observation.
From a similar perspective, when I was at Homeland Security, I was telling Joel that I helped negotiate the use of passenger name records. The EU and the US passenger name records agreement. There have been 3 or 4 since 2002, depending on how you count. I negotiated the most recent one along with the Deputy Secretary. And that was all about making sure that the big data was handled properly. Let's be clear, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection has a legal obligation to receive passenger name records, which are the information on your United profile or your American profile and associated information. And they can receive it up to 96 hours before the flight takes off. And then if the flight changes, then the updates have to be pushed. Airlines across the world, if they want to land in the U.S. or overfly the U.S., they have to provide this information. And so it was my job, together with the Deputy Secretary, to make sure that we had the ability to access the data, as Leslie talked about, but also privacy controls, rules and roles-based access, auditing, logging, looking at what the result-oriented stuff is. And then that was put into the agreement with the U.S. and the EU, and then the EU comes and does an audit. I think they do the same of Treasury for TFTP, and I think that's fine. I mean, candidly, I think that's a good way of both developing the trust on the privacy side, but also holding the departments accountable. We did a bunch of our own auditing as well as the privacy officer, making sure that data wasn't misused, that it wasn't, the ex-girlfriend lookups and things like that, and all those that is really, honestly, the biggest foible of having access to a lot of big data. That's what should be that. Don't look up your ex-girlfriend's phone number. Like, that should be the takeaway. I think that's on like page 93. But it's really true, and the misuse of it, and only handling it for official purposes and so on. And so we did all those audits, and the great news is that Customs actually, didn't misuse it, used it for only specific purposes. I'll tell one anecdote, and then we can go to Bart. But one of the anecdotes is that on your passenger name record information, it could say things like, vegetarian meal, or other, handicap, needs a wheelchair, and things like that. And that was one of the concerns about the EU is, well, if you ask for halal meal, you're going to be targeted differently. If you ask, if you're doing this and that, you're going to be signaled out. And there's a trigger that says that you can look up when anybody looks up any of these fields that are X'd out and looking at it. You need 2 supervisors to look at it, and you need approval. So we did the audit, and in front of the Europeans, we actually requested information. And it triggered and notified all the people. And the last time that they had done it was in the previous audit 5 years earlier. It's the only time they accessed it. But the example I used to the Europeans was, we had the blind cleric who orchestrated the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. So if we had intel that there was going to be a blind guy traveling who may have these certain elements, we may need to unmask that field. But ordinarily, we only unmask it anytime the audit happens.
If I could make one other point. And I think this gets to a point that Benjamin was making earlier with TFTP. The data has to roll off every 5 years. So it's not that the data, unless it's been used, if it's been used and has been found to have substantive applicability to a terrorist case, it is retained. But anything that hasn't been used is rolled off every 5 years, and that is something that the Treasury Department has to verify to the EU. And I'd also say it's not just that that data is important to the United States investigations, it's also important to global investigations, and that Treasury is approached by international law enforcement to ask for Treasury to conduct searches on that information to help in global investigations.
So I come from a little bit of a different perspective at the IIF. So we're an association of banks, insurers, asset managers, and so we work partly on what we call RegTech, so to use new technologies for compliance purposes. And our latest report was on the use of machine learning AI for AML purposes. And I think many of the data sharing problems have been mentioned. What we see generally is they are really stringent for financial institutions. So we have quite some members who are global financial institutions, and the thing is that a financial institution cannot often even share information within its institution in different jurisdictions. Problem is also that many of the data requirements are very different per jurisdictions. So what you're seeing is, of course, as a financial institution, if you're trying to combat, how do you say, money laundering, which is international in character, that you cannot get the group-wide view that you want. And the Basel Committee actually requires, or not requires, but advises banks to take this group-wide view. And so the data sharing issue is one thing. Another one is actually also there's an interaction also between, for example, prudential requirements, so capital requirements, things that are aimed at financial stability, and the goals of information sharing that FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, is working for. For example, financial institutions need to be, there are recovery and resolution plans these days, so you need to be able to cut a bank up in different pieces in the event of a failure of part of the bank. What that means is that IT systems need to be self-standing within different groups. And that in turn means that data sharing between those systems is very hard. So there's a myriad of problems that that financial institutions encounter when they do these assessments.
So I wanted to ask you. I mean, we have two former U.S. officials and one former European official up here, and so I don't think there's any doubt that after the Snowden revelations and other revelations about U.S. intelligence, correct or incorrect perceptions really did fuel this kind of backlash, and in some ways has made the job of law enforcement and intelligence gathering more difficult, at least in some instances. So I guess a good question would be, I mean, and we'll start with you on this one, Leslie. Going forward, what can U.S. policymakers and the intelligence community do in the future to prevent this kind of backlash when the next set of revelations come out about this or that program? What can policymakers do better to try to contain and de-escalate that backlash so that law enforcement isn't further hindered?
So I think I have two answers for your question. As we were talking about in the green room before we came in, so working in the intelligence community for 31 years, when the Snowden revelations came out, my reaction was more, this is terrible. This is terrible from the standpoint of we collect information to keep the country safe and to help other countries keep themselves safe. And now this is out there, and it's going to make it more difficult for us to collect this information. If you were Joe Public, I can understand where you would have been shocked. You would have been troubled. You would have been very disturbed by what you heard. And I think part of it was a shock. Part of it was the way media fanned the the story. I don't think there was as much of a story there as was made out in the media. But I took the opportunity when traveling with my husband down to see my stepdaughter and her husband in North Carolina to say, what do you think of this? I thought, okay, not in the Washington swirl, not in the mix. How is this coming across? And he was really troubled by it. And I said, okay, but do you understand how your data is also used more broadly? When you do a Google search, do you really think the first return that comes at the top of the page is genuinely the one that's the best answer to your question? Or do you think it's one that someone has paid Google to get to the top of your search? Or when they suggest something, do you think that's really the best thing for you? And he said, I know that, I don't care. I don't care. I care that my government knows this. I think there needs to be a broader conversation in our country about what it needs to be done for protection and what that cost can be to your privacy, and help have a dialogue that can say, you know what, my privacy is more important, I'll take the risk over here. Or, you know what, I remember 9/11, I was down there, I work in the financial sector, I know the risks to our systemic viability from this kind of activity. Yes, I want to have, I'm willing to give up some privacy. So that's part of it. I think there needs to be that dialogue. But to the second part of your question is, I think as a policy or policymakers, government can be explaining what are the things that the government is doing to help keep this country safe. Why is that information needed? How is it used? How is it protected? What are the standards that are inside of an organization, that the checks and balances that say, when we find someone who's looked up the ex-boyfriend's records, here's what we do to them.
Do you think that in that instance, after post-noted, do you think the U.S. government did a good job of trying to explain the limitations of what that intrusion really involved, or do you think that they could have done more, or was it just a very difficult and complicated issue to address?
I think it was hugely complicated. You're talking about NSA. When I started in government, NSA stood for no such agency, and I'm not kidding. NSA was very, very, very secretive. I started at CIA for 25 years. I think they were even more secretive than CIA. So there wasn't a culture inside of NSA that said, when someone stands up and turns over the crown jewels, this is how we will react. They just weren't prepared. So in that regard, I think we as a government need to do more to, I keep saying we, I don't work for the government anymore. They as a government need to do more to prepare for situations.
So I actually think, Joel, so when I was at Homeland Security, what we would do is work with our colleagues in intelligence and in other areas, including Todd, good to see you again. Would work with them and go and say, what are you trying to achieve here? What are you trying to work on? Is there a way we can do this and be more privacy protective? Are there built-in rules and roles-based access? Are there auditing? Are there different functionalities? So we would actually have a pretty extensive dialogue about that before something would launch, right? That's the proactive work I was talking about before, which is, working together to make sure we understand the mission and how do we do it and how do we do it most effectively. And in a privacy protective way. That's what my statutory authority says I was supposed to do. There wasn't anyone at NSA at the time asking that question, right? People at NSA are patriots. They wanted to do the right thing. They went to FISA and said, we want to do this. FISA said, okay. They went through the whole process. I disagree with the FISA court's ruling, but FISA said it, and they said, yep. They went through all the steps. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to catch terrorists. They wanted to catch the bad guys. But there was nobody asking the question that I asked with Todd and others, which is, can you do it in a more privacy protective way? Is there a way we can do this without us storing the data, with the hops, with this and that? And I think one of the results of the Snowden revelations is they now have a whole office that does that, led by one of my proteges, Becky Richards, who is the best privacy person I've ever worked with in 20 years of working in privacy. She really gets it. She gets the technology, and she asks the hard questions. And I think that's a great result. And I think if Becky had been there before 2013, maybe we wouldn't have the revelations. We would have had a different dialogue and a slightly different calibration.
So I think all these privacy is really is an issue very much for financial institutions, and of course they are sometimes frustrated by stringent data sharing rules when you cannot even share information that is relevant to an investigation within your institution or among correspondent banks, for example. But of course, there's very much a realization that you need to be able to share data, but at the same time maintain the integrity of sensitive information, privacy. So what we want is very much what we're discussing with regulators is to get an information sharing framework that is more, context dependent, so risk based. So information, for example, a social network selling information for commercial purposes to another corporation, that's something that is very different than financial institutions sharing information for a law enforcement purpose. And that is something that should be better recognized within, legal frameworks.
I was thinking we could maybe turn the issue on its head a little bit. I mean, we're talking about we're talking about U.S. officials or intelligence agencies asking, how can they more effectively get information from companies or other governments. But some countries like Russia right now are requiring software companies to give up, like security secrets about their products. And this is also being done in the name of national security, crime prevention, preventing terrorist attacks. But also, like, undoubtedly, it could help the FSB hack into their software. And some people in the U.S. government have suggested to me that it's hard to tell the companies not to do that in some respects. It's hard for the U.S. government to tell U.S. companies not to do that because in other instances it's U.S. government asking tech companies for help in national security realms as well. But if you're a company, though, how do you view whether to push back on these kind of data requests from national government, from foreign governments, and how do you decide whether to comply? And how do you balance that risk and that desire to be helpful to national security goals?
I think it's so. This is something. For a financial institution, the request from a government, of course, has priority. And what we're seeing, I mean, if you look at financial institutions, the way they conduct their investigations is they look at their proprietary data, so transactions data, client information, things like that. And that is something that is very well within the framework of FATF information sharing. So that is something I think I'm not so worried about. What we're, maybe to touch upon another issue, I think what we're more worried about is something of creating a feedback loop, actually, between financial intelligence units and financial institutions. So what we're currently seeing is if you look at the way that financial institutions conduct their investigations and the way they are then being picked up by financial intelligence units, is that so financial institutions send all these suspicious activity reports to the regulators. And basically, they do not get a lot of feedback on, this activity that you've monitored or that you've detected is something that is actually that has been useful, that appeared to be money laundering, and this is not. So there's the idea that you're sending information into a black box and you don't know what's coming out. And that's not only a problem for the investigation per se, but also very much for the development of algorithms that detect money laundering or suspicious activities on payment systems. If you look, for example, one example that we often use is credit card fraud. Machine learning in itself is not something that is very new. It's already been used for credit card fraud for 12 years or so now. and with very good results. But in money laundering, it's only being used now. And the reason is that with credit card fraud, you have labeled historical data. You will know quite clearly afterwards that this was a fraudulent transaction and this was not. So what you can do is you can train your algorithms using that labeled information. And that's something you could up to recently, you could not easily do with money laundering. There are now ways around it in machine learning, like clustering. Yeah. You can use a kind of proxy for money laundering. So there are things like that. But that illustrates the importance of getting feedback from financial intelligence units so that you can develop your algorithms.
But my question also, just really briefly, is when should companies look at the risk of sharing information and sharing data with intelligence agencies and decide, no, this is too much risk? When should they consider that it's just too risky?
So I thought your question was more, you've got now Russia, China, what have you, saying that these companies have to provide basically code specific information to them. So let me give you a perspective on that, and then I'll jump in with the Intel question. And if I were a financial institution, I mean, financial institutions are always calculating risk. Did I turn mine on?
I think you might have turned it off, yeah. Hang on.
Thank you. She's amazing.
I don't know about that because I'm not fixing it. Eddie, it's not green.
All right, let me yell.
He's going to do a handheld.
Okay. So each and every day, financial institutions are evaluating risk. They're evaluating risk to their organizations, and I would, if I were them, I would put this into the bucket of what kind of a cyber risk does this present. So what, depending upon the country, what kind of sophistication do they have? How could they be accessing parts of my system or proprietary information? An insider threat, you can't underestimate the chance for them to exploit an insider threat in an institution. That's how I would be evaluating that. And then to say, what is the amount of business that I have there? And then to say, how confident am I in my cyber protective systems? One of the things that the financial sector is doing now is starting to look at cybersecurity as a systemic problem, as a systemic challenge. And last October, the 8 globally systemically important banks, or GSIBs, US-based GSIBs, got together and formed something called the Financial Sector Analysis and Resilience Center. And it's located in Arlington, Virginia, and it's adjacent to DHS's NCIC. And that's specifically to understand the cyber threat that they are facing globally, and so they can share information on that. They can understand where the trends are, where the vectors are, and how that they can protect the financial system as a whole, not just one bank. And in sharing that information, can they help prevent those kinds of attacks? And I think that's critically important on cybersecurity. And when we talk about money laundering, I'm wondering if there's a way to replicate something like that within the financial sector as well. To get to your second question about intelligence sharing, or do you want to do that?
Oh no, that was
that's sufficient.
Yeah.
The follow-up, I'd say, so 2 points. One is on cybersecurity. I talk about protecting the ecosystem, right? So your example in Russia, so if I let the Russians see my source code because I'm doing business in Russia, I've not necessarily protected the ecosystem. And the vulnerabilities, anytime you have an ecosystem, the Achilles heel of the lowest common denominator is going to be what you factor and what you don't factor. In terms of your question about what should companies think about in terms of sharing information, in a repeatable way with the intelligence community. Obviously, if there's a specific request that I want Todd Rosenblum's information because he's under investigation, that's easy. And it's true, incidentally, just FYI. But that's an easy one, right? And banks deal with that all the time, as Bart pointed out. But what if you want that kind of continuous feedback loop, the ability to access the data? One of the things I talk about talked about at Homeland Security, and I talk about with my clients, is just because data exists doesn't mean the government should gain access to it. Now, financial institutions, I would actually say we've got TFTP and SWIFT and other things like that. But I do think that one of the things I've noticed with lots of different clients are, well, that's interesting. Wouldn't that be cool to append to whatever data I have, whether you're a company or you're the government? And just because the data is there doesn't mean it necessarily has to be provided to the government, particularly in a systemic way. But that goes to that whole point of thinking about it proactively and going and saying, what are we trying to accomplish? How are we trying to accomplish it? What are the controls we put into it? As opposed to, and none of you have said this, but as opposed to a backdoor letting the government in willy-nilly, whether they be Chinese, Russian, or American.
Can I make another comment on the cybersecurity side? So I tend to see the information in a couple of different buckets. And one is, yes, very specific to a specific warning or a specific attack that may be underway. And there's a very granular piece of information that's associated with that. In terms of intelligence sharing, though, I think that there is tremendous value in what the intelligence community probably knows better than anybody else about the capabilities, the sophistication, the trend lines, the intentions of malicious cyber actors. And that sharing that information, I think, can help inform a decision by a company, for example. Are there certain virus protection companies in, say, Russia that you might want to stay away from?
Hypothetically
speaking,
no
of course. But is there a sophistication in the knowledge that the intelligence community might have that a financial institution or another company might not have that would be beneficial in their decisions they make about either investing in that kind of a capability or, frankly, continuing to do business in that country?
Well, and candidly, I mean, from a privacy perspective, I don't think any privacy person would have any concerns about sharing the malware, the other issues. I mean, we talk about indicators. Obviously, in the financial institutions, as you pointed out, they're very sophisticated in that. FS-ISAC is by far the best information sharing and analysis center. They do a great job about dealing with that, and candidly, with relatively low privacy risk, I would posit, because to the extent that you're sharing personal information, it's about the victim, and you try to mask that and deal with it. But the threats and all the indicators, absolutely, got to share that. The more you know, the better you can protect that ecosystem, the better you can do things. The one follow-up point I'd say about information sharing for intelligence purposes and actually government-to-government sharing is I was on the beginning part of the negotiation for what is now called the Data Protection and Privacy Act, or the Umbrella Agreement, which is information sharing between law enforcement and agencies in the EU and the United States, and kind of how do you do that and how do you not do that. And candidly, there were some real conundrums when it came to information sharing. And the DPPA, we kind of had to cross that Rubicon in order to do it. But we were able to get there. The one anecdote I'd say is when we were talking, like there were early in the negotiations, the European Union was putting in some pretty strict red lines. And even I, as the privacy person, was like, well, that's not going to work. And so the suggestion was, let's have a conference with cops, with policemen, with law enforcement, saying this is how I share information. These are the obstacles I have. These are the difficulties, and this would be better, just to understand what the people on the ground are experiencing every day and how this agreement could benefit it. And the response from the Europeans was, no, we're not going to have a conference. We don't care how it impacts the cops on the street or Europol or whoever it is. We just want to have the principles. They can apply them consistent with the principles. As opposed to, I think in the United States, we're much more operational. We're much more tactical of like, okay, this is an obstacle. How do we solve this obstacle? One may call it reactionary, but it was really striking as the Europeans were like, nope, we have these big, broad principles. We're going to stay there. And then the cops can figure out whether or not they can share after the agreement's all done.
Yeah, I think it's, you're both really right. I think it is getting more attention now from regulators. So We know that FATF has given a recommendation to the G20 to enhance information sharing. The G7 has also had a statement about this. So we are happy that it's getting more attention. And I think, to your point, it is vital as a financial institution to get more of a macro view back from intelligence services where possible, because as it stands, a bank is only looking at its own information, and of course it's much better if you can relate that to global trends, global phenomenon, things like that.
And what about FATF right now? I mean, does this agency actually need to have some teeth? I mean, is it enough to just put out a report every couple of years and sort of, in rather obtuse language, criticize countries for being, not up to snuff? And does it need to have some other method of enforcing or promoting or discouraging people from not listening to its recommendations? It doesn't have enough power to actually make its recommendations effective at all.
Well, yeah, I think it would be good if it would have more teeth. You need more uniformity across jurisdictions in terms of information sharing. Also, very practical things.
What would that look like? Like, how could it have more teeth? Like, what would be a way of empowering it further?
Well, so a very just practical thing is, for example, the way a financial institution files a suspicious activity report with an FIU, so Financial Intelligence Unit, that differs a lot across jurisdictions. And sometimes, if you're a global institution, you're seeing something that's happening across different jurisdictions. It would make a lot of sense to send one message to, like you send an email to a group. But the thing is, you cannot do that because the procedure is different, the regime is different. So even practical things like those would already make sense from FATF to be changed. And then there are, of course, many more high-level privacy-related issues that FATF could also harmonize.
Any other ideas about strengthening FATF or another such international body that can be kind of like an arbiter of whether countries are following this kind of standard? Yeah. I think we're about time. It's about time for questions right now.
Got a question over here. Mike's coming to you.
Okay, thanks. I asked a question this morning about cultural change at the government level. Let me ask one at the personal level. The president of Estonia made a fascinating speech. I think it might have been here. I saw about a year ago. And he talked about every Estonian he's holding up his card, we refer to as a CAT card, that does everything in Estonia that we've been promised would do for us in the government that doesn't. But he talk about the advantages of this. You go to the hospital in Estonia, they have your medical history. It's not a problem. You can be unconscious. They know what you're allergic to already. He closed with the most compelling argument, your statement. He said, it is illegal for the government of Estonia to ask you the same question twice. And anyone who's filled out a DD 398, SF 86, or applied for a loan in this country, that resonates well. And might we someday come to be comfortable with a cultural change? You expressed it nicely. I'd rather have that convenience than my privacy. What can we do from the government level to, for lack of a better term, make it more digestible to give up this which has immense efficiencies in education, industry, medical, etc.
So I actually toured the Estonian, at the time it was a lab in 2010, that they were working on the CAT card and what to do. And the voting, I was really fascinated actually with the voting on how they do it. Denmark has similarly moved to that. I mean, Estonia is 1.5 million people. Denmark's 5.5 million people. But I don't think that's necessarily the whole thing. Going back to what we started this conversation about on the EU versus the US, and also kind of, the commercial, you were talking to your son-in-law, and he said, well, I know Google has it and I don't know it. there's several different surveys that say in the United States, we trust private companies much more with our personal information than we trust the government. If you think about it, we don't have a national identity card, although Real ID is kind of moving towards that. Only 29% of the U.S. population has passports, so we don't have this kind of identity of being tracked it's more. I think it's more of kind of the Western individualist, that sort of concept. We're willing to interact at multiple levels, federal, state, and local, but it doesn't cut across, and there are absolutely inefficiencies in that. But I think that is part of the American concept, while they also like private companies and private, entrepreneurs and so on. In the EU, it's absolutely inverted. Like the numbers are 75% trust the government with the data and 25% trust companies with their data. And so there, if you think about it, everything's on Thomas Hendrik Ilvez's card. His CAT card has not just his medical history, but also his Social Security number, all sorts of other. They don't have the credit issue that we have with Social Security numbers. His all that information. Every time you register in a hotel in Europe, that information is transferred of acceptance and which way they're going to deal with inefficiencies in order to meet that kind of cultural ethos. And candidly, we're probably migrating to the middle. But I do think that this kind of concept of the government holding data is going to take a long time to move to the middle for the United States, in my opinion.
So let me just give you a personal anecdote, and just as a way of saying I think it is going to require renewal of confidence. My SF-86 was compromised. And, oh, by the way, the government, out of the generosity of the taxpayer, was going to be paying for credit services for me for X amount of time. I also got credit services from Home Depot. I got credit services for the breach on my medical information with my government health plan. But when I went in to log into it, what this credit company, what this protection company wanted me to do was to take all of my financial data and consolidate it. They wanted all of my credit card account numbers. They wanted all of my bank account numbers. They wanted my investment account numbers. They wanted everything. And I took one look at that and I shut the page, and I never signed up for the credit protection. Because for two reasons. One, how do I trust that company to hold all that information? And in fact, I believe that company was announced. If I'm a cyber criminal, you better believe I am running fast to figure out how can I get into that company and hack that company. The second reason was I think that information was taken as part of espionage. I don't think that information was taken for cyber crime activities. I think it was an espionage exercise. So long as the individuals who took it keep it safe. So yes, then maybe it's not going to be as much of a cyber challenge. But one last thing, I had one of my credit card companies when I was logging in, it forced me to change my password, and it forced me to change my secret questions. And it gave a list, actually a very long list of secret questions I could choose from. 90% of those could have been deduced from my SF-86. So that is a real significant concern, is you put all that information in one place, can you really trust somebody to keep it safe?
There's a question here and a question there.
Hi, I'm Katayun Hadevi, and I have two questions regarding the privacy. First of all, every few days we get a letter from a financial institute that says, you owe this much on your mortgage, you owe this much on your credit cards, and we can give you, good deal and great deal. If you guys are not, the financial, and you're not sharing information, how do they know how much I owe on my mortgage and different credit cards from different companies? The second one is that I have stage 4 breast cancer. A few years ago, went to Harvard Medical School in Boston to get a recommendation of what I need to do. And then they talked about getting a genetics test test to see if it's genetics or is it environmental or whatever it is. And the good doctor told me, we can do that. We can do your genetic test. But if it is, it's heretical, whatever it is, your children will not be able to get life insurance. Or if they do, it's going to be extremely expensive. So what are we talking about? Privacy between different, if my information is available to everyone who wants to get to it, what are we talking about? Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe first on I think the credit information they get from a credit registry. So that's where they will find it. That's where your credit score is, I believe. So that's where probably they will find your information. Yeah, your second question, I'm really sorry to hear that, of course. Yeah, this goes to the heart of the debate about data and about what do you want to find out about, what do we as people want to find out about ourselves and be put into databases. The thing is, the thought probably is that the life insurer will know the risk, and that will increase the risk, the financial risk in that sense. But that is something, those are very tough decisions. And also as a society, you really need to think about, what should companies get to know and what not? Are there things that we should not let companies know?
With regard to your first question, so the mortgage companies and the credit card companies in the U.S. under the Fair Credit Reporting Act can actually request information, and it is if you request your credit report, you can see that they've done a lookup without it affecting your credit score. That's how they get it. You can ask to opt out of that scenario. It's hard. It's a pain. It's not a seamless process. But you would go to each of the 3 credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, and go and say, I want to opt out of the sharing for that. And that is completely for commercial purposes, and I get you, and it's kind of creepy. Don't disagree. With regard to the health data, I also am sorry. And in fact, my mom did Ancestry.com DNA testing, and I won't do it. I was like, I know that I've seen half of yours, but I was like, I just don't want my DNA stored. I know how Ancestry controls the data. I know they deal with it. It won't deal with life insurance. It's not going to the police, but I still don't want that data to be cataloged and stored in a place where it can be dealt with. So to Bart's point, trying to figure out kind of what your comfort level is hard. It's hard to calibrate with so many different factors.
Thank you, Paul Joyle, NSI. Thank you for your comments. I wanted to follow up on the cultural question a little more, because we're really dealing with a larger duality here in the United States. The same people who are talking about privacy and supporting privacy are probably the most active in social media, putting all elements of their life out there. It's the reason I don't have a social media account, Facebook, and say where I'm having a cup of coffee today, etc. But this is a real problem that leads to certain denials, even when evidence is presented that should have been a concern, namely with Snowden himself. If you look at Snowden spending a few nights in the Russian consulate in Hong Kong, being brought there by one of the WikiLeaks people, it raised immediate counterintelligence concerns for me. And then we find out later on that the compromise of Snowden, the majority, over 90%, had nothing to do with privacy of Americans, et cetera. That there was a huge theft, probably the largest theft of classified information. And as one who used to be Director of Security of the Senate Intelligence Committee, it was shocking to me. With the volume, the sheer volume that was taken. But now, with WikiLeaks colluding and being shown to be part of this Russian information warfare campaign, still the outcry is not sharp about this man, as I believe it should be, of exposing him for what he is. And until we can get to an honest discussion of who is who, and an honest discussion of privacy, your personal choices that you do on social media, etc. We're never going to grapple with the question that's being raised by the gentleman behind us on how we can better protect ourselves with tools like we've seen in Estonia and Denmark and all the rest, because the attack surface today is so large. There's so many opportunities for mischief, both from states and criminals, etc. We have to have a more honest conversation about what privacy is and what the duties and responsibilities of citizenship are. I'd like to hear any comment you have on this.
So thank you for what you said. I know that people can be very divided on what Edward Snowden did. It made me very angry. And it made me angry because there was information taken that had no bearing on the point that he was trying to make, and that's about all I can say about that. I agree with you. I think that there is a very strange cognitive dissonance, if you will, about cries for privacy and then the information that is shared out there. I think what you would find is people would say, but I did that by my own choice. Nobody took that from me. And I don't know that it really hits home until it happens to you. I wonder, to a question that was asked earlier today, that we're willing to suspend some privacy and some conveniences because we're told that the terrorist chatter is up and that there's an attack that's imminent, is because 9/11, even if you weren't alive at that point, will be seared on your brain as something that happened to this country, and something that almost everybody in this country, at least I know I had personal experience there, really it resonates with. I wonder if there's going to have to be such a privacy breach for individual people, for them to finally say, yes, it is worth it for me to have that kind of a CAC card that has all of that information in one place.
Hi, Tim Rideout, thanks. To touch on this and the privacy, I do actually think there has been a conversation going on. Actually, I've been involved in this debate in DC for a while, and a lot of people actually have had this debate, and you have seen actually, I think, a convergence and a recognition that, yes, Snowden revealed way too much. It was severely damaging. And even people who initially came down on the side, like, oh my God, what's the government doing, have now sort of come. Not the whole country has had that conversation, but I do actually think we've gotten to a better place on that. But as far as the privacy security divide, I think it's almost a false dichotomy. Privacy is security. If you're a CIA agent and you're revealed by the Chinese government because the data analytics have revealed you, is that a security threat or a privacy issue? If ISIS publishes your names and says, kill these military people, is that a security issue or a privacy issue? Likewise, and this is the part that I think is missing in our national debate generally, if you're a minority community that's been brutalized by the police in your local community, not necessarily federal government, but state or local, is that a security issue or a privacy issue? And we don't have the same reaction when Muslims are assassinated in this country by white supremacists. We just don't. And until we have that conversation in conjunction, there's a reason some people in this country are still afraid of their government. And I'm not personally, I'm a lucky guy. But until we recognize that the other side of the equation, it depends on who you are, what you're doing, what your recent memory is, and your experiences. How do we get there? I don't know, but I hope we keep having these debates. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but.
One of the things I talk about is and I've heard it from several people, which is it's privacy or security, and it can't be both. That's a false dichotomy, because if you go and say, I don't want another 9/11 to happen, therefore I'm going to give you my CAC card and you can have all this information, which is not what you said. I'm just being hyperbolic, right? Because if you go and say, if I'm going to balance privacy, and I had this conversation every day at Homeland Security, if I'm going to balance privacy and security, well, you're going to overemphasize the physical security, the security aspects, and you're going to underemphasize on this balance the ephemeral, relatively subjective, as we've talked about, concept of privacy. And instead, what I try to talk about is integrating the two, right? As you build the systems, as you build the programs, as you look at the data, as you look for targeting, as you try to do some of the criminal stuff. So I think that you've got to talk, particularly with as much data as there is these days, and what's out there, that it's not necessarily about, you know, the data, but it's about how the data is used and how it's secondary uses and other aspects. And so I think you got to talk about the integration of the two. Not that it's a contrast.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay. Sorry. Oh.
Right next to you, right there.
Oh, right.
Oh, we
yeah.
went away. Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you for a very enlightening panel. My name is Ava, and I arrived in the U.S. 3 months ago, and since then, I've been receiving calls from Scam Likely, and at least 3 calls a day. And that's quite new to me because I've never shared my information. I once answered the call, and it says I had a student loan, and I never studied in the U.S. And I come from Singapore, which, you know, security is. We only have one. They only have one ID system, and it covers all, like address and numbers. But I've never experienced any suspicious call from any number. But this one here, I've never shared any information yet, except when I've never experienced. So how can an individual help the government mitigate those? Those threats. Yeah.
So you're getting calls. They don't go and say, "Hi, Ava. You know, you have a student loan." It just says you have a student loan, right? Yeah. So they're right. They're not targeting you. They're just blasting it out to everybody, and your phone number happens to be within the scope of it. The one thing you can do is go to the Do Not Call list, which is run by the Federal Trade Commission, and I think it's donotcall.gov, where you can go and put your phone number in and say, I don't want to receive unsolicited calls or unsolicited texts. Text is a slightly different thing, but you can go there and register your phone number. Between you and me, it's not going to necessarily stop it, but it's going to decrease it. One pattern I've actually seen recently is that the scammers have been able to mimic my cell phone, my numbers that are close to my home number, right? So, and that's a new trick. So what, I am sorry this is happening to you, and I would register your phone number, and that's about all you can do.
A quick comment. So I've lived here all my life, and I get those phone calls too. So it's not personal. But, you know, there was recently, and you may get one of these, a phone call claiming to be calling from the IRS, saying that they had, the robocall on my phone said, we are calling from the IRS. We want to sue you. It's like, okay. What people did, what I did, was reported the phone numbers, because the number will come up on your phone, reported the phone numbers to the IRS. And the IRS went after these people and actually arrested a group of people that was making these phone calls. And just as an aside, the IRS will never contact you by phone. They will only contact you by mail. So back to your student loan question, I don't know if there's an organization in the U.S. government or there's somebody that you could notify to say, hey, I got this fraudulent phone call. I got this fraudulent phone call. You can provide the number. Secondly, you can buy phones now, cordless phones now, that in the handset you can block calls. I've got a gazillion phone numbers blocked on my cell phone, on my home phone, because I'm constantly getting these ridiculous phone calls, scams, or Microsoft is calling because, oh my gosh, I've got this virus on my computer, and let's walk over to your computer, and if you log in and you do this and you do that, well, then I'll take care of you. Question I always ask is, you know, my watch has stopped What time is it? Can you tell me what time it is? They'll claim that they're calling from the United States. They're not calling from the United States. They're calling someplace else. But you can reduce the harassment, but then I also think some of these you can find ways to report them and let law enforcement go after them.
I think that's about all the time we have. Thanks so much, guys. It's very good to meet you. I feel like how long have you been at Chenerville?
Well.